much. Sorry, I had to push the button there. So what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about what I do in my job and give you a brief high-level summary of one of my key projects. And I'm going to be explaining to you the changes to public access to federally funded articles and why everyone should care about this. And I'm going to briefly explain to you the role of publishers in this system and explain how you can share your views on all of this. So you may not know this, and I wouldn't be surprised if you don't, but scientific articles that result from research funded by the federal government are not currently required to be available to the public less than 1 year after they're published. We refer to this as the embargo period. And this surprises people who assume, well, taxpayer dollars paid for this, surely it must be available. To be fair, there are some publishers that set periods less than a year, for example, 6 months. And there are more options now for what we call open access, which is a term in publishing, which means immediate availability to a final published article, usually, as you can imagine, for a fee. So as an example of a typical model for how you would get access to research results of any kind, you would pay money to get a physical journal, and that often includes an online scientific publication right when it comes out. So publishers have gotten used to this compromise. They're okay with agency policies on this because they're cool with the 12 months. The tricky issue here, and this adds another layer of complexity, is because publishing in high impact journals, so those are the fancy journals that really matter a lot for an academic's resume, for example, Science or Nature, things you might hear about on the news, are really still the gold standard in appointment, tenure, and promotion processes. The incentives, unfortunately, are still for this traditional publishing model, but I will say that things are changing, and universities are starting to look at things like open science practices, for example, good data sharing practices, in these criteria for appointment, tenure, and promotion. So right now, in order to get access to these research results, you really have to be a researcher or a healthcare provider at an institution that has a library that pays for access to it. Now for the good news. There are new rules that are requiring the immediate availability of manuscripts, and I use the term manuscripts, which means the content of an article, so not necessarily its final published version with all its formatting and the colors that you have grown to know and love from things like the New England Journal of Medicine. And once these new policies take effect that agencies are currently working on, access will be available to everyone. And this importantly includes patients and advocacy groups that advocate for patients, often with particular diseases or conditions. Healthcare providers in rural communities that don't have access to institutions with fancy library budgets, and those who may be at institutions but aren't well resourced with robust library budgets. And even those with robust library budgets, fees for subscriptions are really getting out of control for many of them. So what does this mean and why should you care? Because the sharing of more information faster to more people speeds science, it provides new opportunities for collaboration, and most importantly, it's the right thing to do. So what's the role of the publishers here? I will say, I'm not going to get into it, but Europe in particular has taken a different approach. They kind of want to throw the publishing industry on its head. And the United States, as you can imagine, as a capitalist society, is not trying to change journal models or business models. That's not our jam. We would be hearing from everyone in Congress if that were the case. What we want to do is allow the taxpayers access to the stuff that they paid for. So the research results that they paid for through the research. So as I mentioned, publishers have gotten used to this 12-month maximum embargo period. And we're not quite sure what's going to happen when all these new policies take effect, but some publishers and journals are starting to make some changes to their policies. But again, there are many unknowns. As I mentioned, it's a really complicated system, and all these journals and publishers have come up with all sorts of convoluted models and fee structures that make it really complicated. But many worry that we're going to switch from a pay-to-read system to a pay-to-publish system, and that is a valid concern. And some journals charge a lot for immediate openness through the journal itself, as I mentioned. And this can be upwards of $10,000 for the fancy journals, but that's not the typical or average price. That's just an extreme. In addition, there's all kinds of publishers. There's large for-profit publishers, and there are smaller professional societies that exist really to educate members in their communities, researchers, clinicians, and they often rely on funding from their journals and the subscription revenue. Now, I'm sure there are all kinds of stats, and I'm not going to share those on when a journal publishes, how much of that is federally funded science, and how much of that might be research funded by other sources. But agencies are working on these policies, and I just want to note a few areas to pay attention to: how agencies want this to work, what's expected of federally funded researchers through these policies, and the extent to which agencies will rely on specific regulations that really allow them to make these manuscripts available to the public. So keep your eye out if you're interested for opportunities to comment on draft policies, which agencies with big research budgets often do, for example, National Institutes of Health, where I work, or the National Science Foundation. And in some, things are changing for the better, and federally funded research results will be more accessible to the public in the near future. There are some unknowns in what publishers will do, but agencies do want to hear from anyone and everyone interested. Thank you so much.